All right, y'all. So, welcome back to Building a Fighter. My name is Dr. Austin Shane, sports chiropractor, strength coach, wrestling coach. Y'all know me, but we are starting off our season 2 strong. We have a sports dietitian on the podcast. His name is Alex Lamond. I pronounced that correctly ish.
Perfect.
Love it,
Perfect.
dude. He's a sports dietitian out of Australia, and he actually reached out to me, which is kind of dope. I'm really pumped to have this guy on the podcast and talk about weight cutting in particular, as well as how you can become better with your diet for combat sports. So, Alex, tell us a little about yourself. Tell us how you got involved with combat sports, and let the people know who you are.
Yeah, first of all, Austin, thank you for having me on. I've listened to your podcast for a while now, and it's just it just seemed like the right fit, and I'm really in line with a lot of the things that you talk about. So thanks for having me on.
100%.
I am Sydney based, so traveled around a little bit growing up, but been in Sydney for the last 15, 16 years. Currently, I do the weight cuts and the nutrition for a few of the Australian boxers that just went to Paris. I work with Ibi, who's the WBC Australian champion in Muay Thai, and I work with quite a few national champions in Jiu Jitsu as well. So, big range of, I guess, combat sports, but also in terms of the time between weigh-in and competition and what that means in terms of how much you can cut, what you can do around that. Big range of that as well, which is why I want to jump on and speak about it.
Oh yeah.
Outside of, I guess, how I got into combat sports, it's probably not like the way that most people get into. I feel like a lot of people, sport in general, dietetics in general, and combat sports, a lot of people sort of grow up with it being a big part of their life. And for me, it's something that I found probably a little bit later, like as I was getting a little bit older. Got into combat sports, did some boxing when I was growing up, and I remember I did my first spar and just got absolutely crushed, just got smashed.
As
And
most people
uh,
do, though, dude.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So just got destroyed, and I think probably at the time, like I wasn't ready mentally to cope with that, so just stepped away, and then like now that I'm coming back and like embracing that feeling has been awesome.
Fuck yeah. Well, so my first question for you is because I know you do combat sports, but you also do team sports as well, right? You were saying rugby, Aussie football, and then I was looking up your bio, like sailing, which is honestly super
Yeah.
cool. What's the difference between what an athlete for a combat sport versus like an athlete for a team sport has to go and put into their diet and focus on the dietetics of it?
Yeah, yeah, so it's so different. Like sailing is probably a little bit more similar to combat sports in the sense that for team races and regatta styles, they need to make weight as a
Oh
crew.
shit, I
Um,
didn't know
the
that.
main difference, yeah, yeah. So they need to make weight as a crew. They can't be above a certain weight. They sort of need to be in a
Okay.
range. But then they also need to be competing at that weight. So a little bit different. Like in that sense. And team sports, our focus sort of steps away from weight and more towards performance. So you'll have people who perform best at a higher body fat percentage, people that perform best at a lower body fat percentage, and it's less about optimizing body composition and more making sure that every session, every match, that they're getting the most out of that.
Got you. What have you, as a practitioner, what have you gotten from working with combat sports as opposed to working with team sports? Is it harder? Is it easier? Is it just different? Like, what's the experience like on your end?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big reasons I got into combat sports to start with, in terms of nutrition and dietetics, is just because there's so much more that I feel like you can do. Making weight is one thing, but performance as well. It's so important in combat sports, and it's something that if you overlook it or you do things in not the best way, it's going to make a massive impact on your performance and how you feel in times of competition. So I would say that's the biggest difference. Just the ability to make a bigger
Yep.
impact is is probably what I would find in combat sports.
Heck yeah. It's cool because like when I tell people like so I work with American football, but then I also work with MMA and wrestling. Specifically, I've wrestled my whole life.
Nice.
But the difference between working with on the strength and conditioning and the healthcare side with a combat athlete versus a traditional team sport athlete is I have to know so much more. Like I have to be so much more on and I have to be so much more adaptable because like if I'm gonna like similar to probably rugby or Aussie rule football, like if I'm working with a NFL player, then they need I just have to fit them into a mold. If you're an offensive linemen do offensive lineman things. We got to power clean. We got to be able to squat heavy. We got to be able to do check off the boxes. Combat sports, if I'm working with Volk or Max Holloway at 145, right? They're completely different body styles. They have completely different fight styles. They have completely different objectives of winning that they have to go into. And the same could be said about the dietetic side, the approach to nutrition is that like I have one of my 125ers, he was talking with the PI and he actually has to lose muscle mass because he's too big for the weight class. And
Yeah. Yeah.
that's not something any other sport would ever say. It's like, oh yeah,
No.
man, I want you to lose muscle. I want you to actually start to catabolize yourself. Like that's
Yeah.
nuts. And that just adds
Yeah.
another wrinkle into the job you have to do as the dietitian. That just makes you better at your job. And that's what I love about combat sports is like it makes you better at your job because you have so many more variables at play.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like in combat sports, there's so much more science that goes
Yeah.
into it. Like especially if we look at percentages of body weight being lost, that's one thing, but also everyone and their body styles, like you said, that they're all going to have a different approach, and it all has to be personalized. Even the sweat outs at the end, what people can tolerate and what their sweat rates are, and planning around that is huge. But then also understanding the science of how much can you be losing before you start taking water out from inside the cells, which you won't be able to replace, and also how do you get that back in, and what's your plan around it. I find that it's a lot more in depth, and there's also a lot more science that sort of pops in those times where you need to pivot or change plans. Like for example, if someone needs to lose muscle, which, like you said, is unheard of in any other sport, but happens in combat sports, to be able to safely make a weight. How you change that and how you change your diet is huge.
100%. And that kind of leads into from a weight cutting side, like when we're talking about the science of weight cutting, what are your key points when it comes to helping an athlete? Is there a certain way you like to do that sweat out, you call it, or and then what do you have to do as far as working their way down to get to the sweat out so that we aren't just dropping, we'll say 12% of your body weight in the sweat out? Because I've been a part of some very, very good weight cuts where we're only doing 5 to 7%. I've been a part of some really, really bad sweat outs where we're doing anywhere between 11 to 13%. And the difference in performance is wild. So, how do you approach that from your side?
Huge. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it, but I think the starting point is just working backwards. So every fighter will be different in terms of what they're comfortable sweating out. Some people will like to sweat out just maybe 2-3%.
Mhm.
Like in kilos, we say like 1 or 2 kilos. I think pounds, it's like four
Yeah.
pounds or
Yeah.
something.
2 kilo.
I'm not
Yeah.
sure.
4 pounds.
But then you'll have people there will be people in the UFC that um, are, are ready to sort of cop a little bit of a performance loss to get on weight, and they would prefer to sweat out, like getting into that like 5-6%, not including what they've done in fight week,
Yep.
right? So always an individualized approach. Like we always push for what's going to get the most out of your performance, but everyone's going to be different in what they do. In terms of what we do for weight cutting and how we plan that out, it really depends on how much time you have between your fight and your weigh-in.
Mhm.
The more time you have between the weigh-in and the fight, the more that you can do to manipulate your weight, because we're able to bring those things back in,
Okay.
right? For example, if someone is doing a 24-hour weigh-in period, you can do something like dropping their carbohydrate intake in the week leading up, because you know that you're able to restore that by the time that they compete, right? But if someone's doing a jiu-jitsu comp and they weigh in and they're going to compete 20 minutes later and then have to do multiple bouts, you can't do that because they're going to be absolutely drained when they start.
Right.
So really it's working backwards. We have things like, carb manipulation, sodium manipulation, water loading, water restriction, sweat outs, and a few other things in terms of heat acclimation and all of that that you can use. And then once you understand how much we're going to be able to lose on fight week, then we work back from there and we see what do we need to do to get to that point. Ideally, you don't want to be losing more than 1% of your body weight a
Mhm.
week. Anything more than that, you're probably guaranteed to be losing muscle, which sometimes you have to
Right.
do, but it's not something you want to be doing consistently. The very best is if you're losing half a percent of your body weight a week, then it's not going to have any major effects to your performance during the camp. But somewhere between that 0.5 to 1% is what we're looking for each week. And then from there, we build out the plan, and then it really depends on, is this feasible? Is this actually going to get you on weight? And then making those tweaks and finding out those ways to individualize it from there.
Heck yeah. Well, so it kind of sounds like, so for strength conditioning, we do something called a needs analysis for the sport, right? You do a needs analysis for the person in front of you, but you also have a needs analysis for the sport. And each combat sport is different. Do you guys have to do essentially a needs analysis for, like you said, like a jujitsu weigh-in is very different than say an MMA weigh-in because you have a same day weigh-in, which is similar to American wrestling. Like my whole life, I did everything wrong. If you've listened to, if anybody's listened to the podcast and know Christina, you've heard my history with wrestling. I would basically have a peanut butter sandwich, I would have Starbursts, and then I would go wrestle. And I would do that all week, and I'd lose my 15 pounds a week, and I would go compete at probably 60% and still win somehow, probably because the other person across from me is doing the exact same thing. But now the science is so much better. That being said, what does a needs analysis look like for a jujitsu athlete, so to say? Like when you break down what they need to do, what exactly are you trying to highlight for that sport?
Yeah, yeah. I think first of all, just something you said before. It's yes, the science is getting better and we're understanding more, but there's still so many athletes that are doing what you were doing.
Dude,
Having some
so
starburst,
many. And
having
especially in like when they're 18 to 22, 23, when they can get away with it. Like when you're a college athlete, you can get away with it. But that doesn't mean you should, because the guys that are winning national championships, the guys that are going from university to the professionals, those guys aren't the ones that are getting away with it. And if they are, they're the top 0.0001%, right? If
yeah,
you want a
yeah,
chance to get to the next level, you got to do things right.
yeah, yeah. It just gives you such a competitive edge. Like you said, if you're getting away with performing at 60%, imagine if you can perform at 100%.
100%.
The level that you can get out of it and the edge that you can get out of it is just so
Yep.
massive.
Um,
I
but
forgot what
jujitsu,
question you asked before. Jiu-jitsu, yeah. Needs analysis, yeah. Again, it really depends on so many
yeah,
factors. Probably from a science standpoint, it's more so around what they've cut before, what they're looking to
yeah,
do. We like to get DEXA scans, like a body composition scan, and we can use that to sort of identify where we think their ideal weight class is going to be.
mhm,
But at the same time, probably the most important thing is understanding what their preferences are. And if we say, hey, we think you should be at this weight class, and they say, actually, I don't know if that's going to fit my lifestyle because I really like eating out and I really like having family meals, and like my mother-in-law cooks, and I can't tell her to change it
right.
up. And that's fine, right? And it's sort of identifying from there. So from a needs analysis perspective, it's really what the science says is best, and then taking the individual advice and changing the plan from there to find something that's actually going to work for you.
Okay, nice. And then something else you mentioned earlier was heat acclimation. I feel like that word gets thrown around a lot by athletes. The people that know what they're talking about, I love when they explain what it means. So to you and for your athletes, what does heat acclimation look like?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to explain it without sort of diving like super in depth is it's a way to train your body to sweat out more readily and to make that process easier, right? So if you are, let's say you decide to use the sauna, I'm sure we'll talk about it later, but I prefer to use the bath. But let's say you decide to use the sauna and you know you're going to sweat that out. It's hard to sit in a sauna for a while. There's ways to make it easier, but the temperatures and everything that you do there, there's ways to make it much easier. But no matter what, it's hard and it's not a fun experience. So what heat acclimation does essentially is by exposing yourself to the heat and exposing yourself to the temperature over time, over the course of, we'll go up to 12 weeks, but it's really just, how much time you have to expose yourself. It lets you more readily sweat, but it also decreases the perceived stress and the perceived exertion of sweating out. So for us, it's just a way to sort of get that extra 5%, where you can just make your life a little bit easier and have to stress a little bit
Okay.
less.
And then do you have to do it in the same method? So, like, say you're a bather for your sweat out. Do you have to heat acclimate in the bath or can you heat acclimate in the sauna?
Yeah, either one is
Okay.
fine. We like to just say do the same one, just so you're kind of used to what that experience is like. But it's really just heat exposure that's the main thing. And I think probably the biggest takeaway is the actual heat that you need to be exposed to is not that high. I don't know the Fahrenheit, but I'm going to say it in
You're good. I'll
Celsius
put a
for
conversion in the notes.
cool. If you're sweating out with a bath, all you need to do, and same with the sauna, is although the sauna is a little bit higher, and I'll explain that, but with the bath, all you need to do is get your core body temperature higher than what it is now, right? So if you're sitting at 37 degrees internal body temperature, the bath just needs to be somewhere between 38 to 40, and that's not that hot. It's kind of like a slightly warm bath, and that's enough to get you sweating. So that's sort of the level of exposure that we're looking at. Some people like going higher. The sauna, because there's less contact points with the air, that goes up to sort of like that 45 to like 50-degree Celsius range. And exposure from that is what we're looking for. Most people in the sauna will just pretty comfortably sit in at 65, but it's just not that necessary. So really, any exposure that's sort of activating those heat shock proteins and anything that's sort of raising that core body temperature is going to be enough. And the other thing is you don't need to be dehydrating yourself while you're doing that. So while you're trying to expose yourself and it's not the final sweat out, drinking room temperature water to keep you hydrated is what we recommend as well.
Dude, that's like so that's why I wanted you to explain it. So I get the bro science version from all the fighters and what they think heat acclimation is. And a lot of
Yeah,
people, they're sitting in saunas and they're 30, 40 minutes and they won't drink water while they're doing heat acclimation because they think that's they have to replicate the weight cut. Is that's what they
yeah,
think heat acclimation is. And
yeah,
I'm like, bro, you are just needlessly
yeah.
suffering because we don't need that. All we need to do is get the heat exposure, get your core body temperature up, and prepare yourself to sweat. And that stimulates the cascade that we're looking for. That's it. Why suffer when you
Absolutely.
don't have to?
Yeah, absolutely. And, like, to be honest, I get why people think that because it makes sense that, yeah, we're practicing to sweat out and be dehydrated, so I should be dehydrated. But the science just doesn't support that. And all the science points towards saying it's absolutely fine to be drinking water and being hydrated. And if it makes your life easier, then there's no reason not to do it.
100%. That's why I have like having smart people on the podcast. You can explain it so well, dude. So one of the main things I do want to talk to you about, and this is a little bit off the weight cutting. I want to bring it back, but a little bit off the weight cutting. You have a guide on your Instagram talking about nutrition for injury, and injury
Yeah.
is the second part of my job as the sports med guy through most of my athletes. What does nutrition for an injury look like? Like what does the athlete typically have to change about their nutrition to accelerate the recovery process?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm glad you brought that up because it's not something that I get to talk about that
Bro, I'm
often. Uh,
prepared. I
yeah,
deep dove on your Instagram. I got all the gems.
that's good. Nutrition for injury is different to nutrition for performance and nutrition for making weight, but really the question is, what is our goal in this current phase of rehab, and how do we support that? right? There's some extras that we do for any sort of tendon or ligament based injury that we sort of add on top of that. But in general, I would categorize an injury into a few stages, right? Number one is like the initial injury and how we sort of work around inflammation. And to be honest, because there's and you would know more about this than I do. There's a few debates around how much inflammation do we want to allow, how much do we want to cut out. So really, that's more so directed by the physio that I'm working with, whoever that physio is, and then from there I take probably a little bit of a greater role. So, for example, the first phase when they can't use an injured area is about muscle retention, right? How do we make sure that we're not atrophying any muscle, and how do we keep as much muscle there as possible? In terms of that, we're looking at making sure you're getting enough protein, making sure that protein distribution is good, and making sure you're having things like creatine, which is going to help with muscle retention as well. And then as you start moving into more performance based parts of your rehab, it's just saying, how do we support that? How do we make sure that you're eating the right things to have that appropriate inflammatory response without it being overdone or underdone? And what do we do around that in terms of your performance? And then as they start getting back into returning to training, that's when we start sort of shifting more towards performance goals and body composition
Okay.
goals, right? Probably the main thing is during a rehab phase, a lot of people are really nervous about gaining
Hmm.
weight. It's something that I talk about a lot is people almost think it's an opportunity to lose weight because they don't have to worry about running around or fighting or competing. But you need to be supporting your body for that rehab process. If you're not fueling yourself enough, it's going to delay that rehab process because you're not giving your body the energy that it needs. And
100%.
the last thing is with tendons and ligaments. The other thing that we add in is collagen use. We like to add in collagen before training. We do, or before your rehab exercises. We do 15 to 25 grams of collagen, probably around 30 to 60 minutes before, with the idea being that because tendons use collagen as its protein source, as its building source, by having that in a higher concentration in the blood, when the tendon is sort of more readily absorbing nutrients, we can just speed up that recovery process a little bit.
Heck yeah. I love that. I've had a few ACLs recently, and that was one of the main things that I've picked up from the dietitians I've talked to is that because you know how people are with supplements. They're like, like you don't need this, you don't need that. But that was the one thing outside of creatine. Everybody loves creatine. If you don't love
Yeah.
creatine at this point, you're just you're
Yeah.
behind and you're honestly just negligent because
Yeah.
every research study I've seen on creatine is great. But that everybody collagen was like the super supplement for a little bit, and then you know how everything goes kind of like this, where like it gets at the
Mm,
top, and then people are like, oh, it doesn't work for everything, and it starts falling out of favor. But that doesn't mean it doesn't work for certain things. Just because it's not a super supplement doesn't mean there isn't the right time and a place for that. And when you have, say, you're a chronic ankle sprain person, say you are recovering from an ACL, say you're recovering from, I mean, even like a UCL where you have like bone chips in your elbow, but you also have a UCL that's just sticky. Like, if we have a ligament involved, why aren't we adding in the collagen to the nutrition to help them get a little bit stronger and maximize that window of recoverability that the PI talks about in a way that's beneficial for that athlete? Because that you can only do so much with manual stimulation. You can only do so much with muscle work. You can only do so much with rehab. But if we combine that with the nutrition side, which is how your cells and tissue kind of repairs itself. I don't know if the listeners know that, but you can exercise all you want, but if you're not putting the right thing into your body, you're not going to recover the same way. Then why don't we? Because it's almost like a hidden superpower where you can get that extra 10% that instead of, for say, an ACL, you're out 6 to 9 months, maybe it's 5 to 8 months. You still have to go through the healing time of no matter what, there's a certain amount of time that that ligament has to reattach and has that graft has to take, so to say, but you can still accelerate that process in a way that is safe and effective as long as we're listening to physiologic healing times. And this is where I love collaborating with people like yourself because there's no reason why the athlete should have to think about this. This shouldn't be something they have to think about on their own. They should be athleting. Like they're out there doing their thing. They got to focus on the 97 different training sessions and all right, the mental state, which is another thing we talk about where you need a mental professional as well. But if we can just add one less wrinkle into the really stressful time that is an injured state, then why don't we? And that's a very easy thing to add in.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, what the athlete has to focus on is such a big part of every process, whether it's rehab or just their performance in general, or whether it's leading into a competition. I always think that any sort of field which is supporting an athlete, dietetics in particular, I always view my role as two things. One, of course, the underlying base is how do we make sure that you're performing at your best, but almost in a way, more importantly, is how can we take as much stress away? If if the athlete knows that they don't have to worry about something, and they don't have to focus on it, and they just need to follow the plan, they just need to get it done, and they can let their mind think about other things, then that's huge. The more stress that we can take away, I think is the better approach.
100%. And now pivoting into something else that athletes typically have to think more about if you're one gender versus the other. Talk to me about the difference in weight cutting between male and female athletes because I know the hormonal side is massive, but a lot of they don't typically talk about that unless you get into the UFC and you're talking with the PI.
Yes, yeah, mate. These questions are so good. I'm so glad you brought it up as well. Yeah, it's a huge area, and you're right. It's something that doesn't really get discussed that much. From a weight cutting perspective, really, it's about identifying what a female cycle is and where they're going to land in terms of the fight, and also understanding how their weight's going to fluctuate throughout that. So during the luteal phase, just before they get their period. There's a very likely chance that they're going to be holding on to more water, and they're going to retain
Yeah.
more water. So if you know that their fight is going to be around that period, it's something that you need to be factoring in. And the other thing that we look at a lot is around water loading and the risks around that if someone is fighting or water loading during that luteal phase. The thing that we're always hyper aware about in terms of female athletes is hyponatremia. So when the concentration of sodium is so diluted that it causes cardiac issues, right?
Okay.
And it's something that happens a lot more than we'd like because of unsafe weight cutting practices. But that's our main thing. And if someone is fighting during their luteal phase, as a rule of thumb, we don't do any water loading,
Okay.
just because the risk is too great, and we just manage it throughout the weight cut in the lead up to that and throughout the fight camp.
Okay. Hmm. That's so you don't even go in like don't go in with like a strong electrolyte to try to water load in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, well, I think for us the biggest issue is this is if someone is doing like a 24-hour weight
Got
where we're doing
yeah.
anything. Biggest issue is something like an electrolyte. Yes, is going to be fantastic, but as soon as we convert over to doing low sodium in the
Yeah.
2 to 3
Gotcha.
out, that's where we see the
Yeah. So
issues.
it's the day of the cut is the problem.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
Got you.
exactly.
Got you. So no matter what, because like I don't even know, what do you recommend for water loading? Like what is your typical water load? Is it a I'm sure the answer is it depends on everybody. Like, but is it like a 3 to 5 day process, 2 to 4 day process? Like, what does that look like for your athletes?
Yeah, there's you would know this as well. There's so much just like
Yeah,
random bro science around this, like
100%.
so many different protocols, and it's because really there's been one study that actually looks at this, right? And the study pushes it pretty far. So what the study says is we're looking for 100 milliliters per kilo of body weight,
Mhm.
I believe, for 3 days, and then one day where you drop that down to 15 milliliters per kilo of body weight.
Okay.
So that's what we do for our water loads. Now, the reason that they chose those amounts in the study is because they wanted a proof of concept. So it probably is more than what's actually required. But because there hasn't really been too much research around it, highlighting that we can do less or we can change it up, that's usually what we stick to.
Okay. Got you. And then bringing it back, because one of the biggest things I'm in building a fighter is communication with athletes, communication with coaches, communication with the interdisciplinary systems. But one of the largest things I've found with female athletes and getting them comfortable with their cycle going all the way through is that you aren't going to have the same, not that it's ever linear, but that same linear drop. It's a lot more of that up and down graph as the peaks and the valleys, as opposed to a linear drop on weight. How do you communicate that to your female athletes? Because weight cutting is not just physical, but it's extremely mental. And
Yes.
getting yourself to the point where you feel comfortable with the weight cut and really comfortable with the process is one of the hardest parts of this sport.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's a big area, and it's something that I always think about a lot when it comes to female weight cuts. Probably two areas that we look at the most. The first one is just the more communication you can have around it, the more contact points you have, the better. There are going to be times where male or female, they're going to be stressed about how their weight's
Mhm.
shifting, and it's, I guess, your responsibility as a dietitian and as someone on the team to be able to put those fears at ease, or if it is a problem, be able to fix that and make sure that they know that it's something that's under control. So probably the biggest one is communication. For example, when I'm looking after a fighter, they just have full access to me for the 6 weeks leading up to a fight. They can message me, they can call me, they can do whatever they want. And we check in on a call once a week, and plans get updated throughout. So the more communication, the better. And the second thing is starting to look at weight trends instead of looking at just the the set amount each day is the other thing that we look at, because it is going to fluctuate a lot, more with females with stagnation, but with males as well, their weight is going to fluctuate a lot. So we use an app. Well, I do it differently on Excel, but I try and get my fighters to use an app called Happy
Okay.
Scale, uh, which, instead of it telling you this is what your weight is for the day, it gives you a trend. And as long as the trend is still moving
Okay.
nicely, then that is what we prefer to look at, just because for the fighter, it just, they get to worry a little bit less about it.
That's awesome. I've never even heard of that. I'm gonna have to download that because that's sick.
Yeah,
Also,
you
dude, the
should, yeah.
communication must be easy for you. People love that Aussie accent. It's just so calming. Like you're working with Americans, they're just like, oh, okay, we're good. We trust you.
Yeah. It's so weird because I actually don't think I have an Australian accent, and it's only when I go overseas that people bring it up, and I'll think, oh wow, like I didn't realize it was so strong. But in Australia, I would say I have a relatively. I'll have people in Australia that think I have an American accent, which is
Bro,
wild.
I
But
just sat there when we interviewed Gavin. I literally just sat there and just was like in awe. Like I was just like, "Oh, this is dope." For like half the podcast, I'm like, "Oh, just keep talking. I don't even want to ask questions. You just keep talking."
that's awesome.
But you brought up the word trends, and one of the questions I have for you is the unfortunate part about nutrition is that it is extremely trendy. What are
Yeah.
some trends that have you found recently that are detrimental to combat athletes that you've seen combat athletes get into that aren't good for the performance or the health process of getting down to weight or even just performance in general?
Yeah, probably
Yeah,
keto carnivore is the one that immediately springs to
yeah,
mind. I think people like it because when they initially do it, their weight just
yeah.
plummets. Like they get a massive, massive weight drop, because they're losing all of the water that's stored with carbs, with glycogen. Um, and they initially feel really good about it, and they feel like, oh, I'm not bloated because I'm not holding on to that much water, so I feel great. And they get really keen on it, and they're probably getting more protein, so maybe their recovery is a little bit better, but it just falls off so
Yep,
quickly. It will guarantee a decrease in your performance during the fight camp,
100%.
or during training in general. You just can't use that high intensity part of your anaerobic system as efficiently as you could if you were getting enough carbohydrates. And I think it also gives sort of a false belief that people are closer to making weight than they are, because they've already used one of those fight week
Mhm.
strategies, which means that they end up panicking and then having to sweat out much, much more than they thought that they would have.
I didn't even think about that. That takes away essentially it takes away a tool out of the toolbox that you can use later down the road. If you're doing it the entire
Exactly.
time, that takes away one of your tools to get down to weight. It's a different way to think
Exactly.
about it. I like that. I'm gonna I love this podcast because it brings me different ways to explain this shit to my fighters. Because like I tell
Yeah.
everybody, like even though like through school, like I had a decent nutrition in like, but I know enough to be dangerous. I could help a
Mhm.
regular person, okay. I
Yeah.
cannot help professional fighters. That is not my role in any way, shape, or form. So I love like
Yeah.
if you can just use the tool out of the toolbox analogy, that clicks with everybody. Like they just get it.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
one of I guess one of the hot button topics for MMA performance, and it's because all these athletes are getting sponsorships, and not just MMA, Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, boxing, whatever, is supplements. We've talked about collagen, we've talked about creatine. Are there any that you really, really like? And also following that up, are there any that are just massively overrated that these people should not be spending their money on?
Yeah, that's a great question. Again, there's in Australia, our Institute of Sport, the AIS, has a supplement framework
Okay.
where every supplement which is used is graded from A to D, with A being there is so much research here that we know it is effective. B being there's promising research here. We're not 100% sure just because there isn't enough depth of data, but it looks really promising. C being this doesn't
Yeah,
like
this sucks.
it's not anything. D being it's banned or it's going to be detrimental to your performance.
Gotcha.
So, for example, grade A
Yeah.
creatine, like a simple grade A sports gel, simple grade A. Grade B, something like collagen,
Mhm.
which we pretty sure is effective, but then it's just about sort of now getting more in depth and identifying, okay, what's the right dosage, what's the right timing, can you just have like a protein powder instead, and kind of figuring that out. Grade C being BCAAs, which is probably what I'd say is the overrated
Yeah.
one of, yeah, like it tastes nice, but it's not actually making a difference to your
Yeah.
performance, right? Um, Probably the one that I think is underutilized the most, that people would know about roughly, but wouldn't really know the correct way to take it or how to use it appropriately is beta alanine. It's the thing in pre-workouts that give you that
Gives you the
tingle
fucking
sensation.
itches. Makes you feel like ants are
Yeah,
crawling under your skin. I love that shit.
yeah, it's the thing that gives you the itches, and the reason why they put it in supplements, is because it almost shows you that it's
Mm,
working. It almost shows you that the supplement that you've taken is doing something, and of course, that itch is like you can't just be sitting around doing
yeah,
nothing. Like you have to go move to sort of deal with that. Where beta alanine is most effective, though, is when it's a daily dose.
okay,
So the idea behind beta-alanine is that if you can saturate your stores in your body, then it buffers lactic acid. So for combat sports, that is a huge, huge, huge advantage if you can do that. The loading phase is 6.4 grams per day for four
okay,
weeks, or 3.2 grams for per day for 8 weeks, and then just dropping to 1.2 grams, which is quite
yeah,
low. So it's about just loading up and then maintaining that, and that's where you get the most benefit from it. And I think if there was just sort of a slight shift in the way people think about beta alanine, it would make a huge difference to so many people's performance.
100%. I've seen that stuff work. So I had a couple athletes that suffered with. So like for the people at home, if you don't know the lactate system, so the lactate system is that intermediate system where it's your high intensity effort, but it's not necessarily our top end. Think about it like our 75 to 80% that effort, but sustaining through. That's what you feel when you're grappling, when you start to feel your arms are heavy or your legs get really heavy and you just feel stuck in the mud. And I've had a few athletes that the PI recommended them to start taking because they're all Thorne everything. So they just sent them out Thorne beta alanine and they put them on this loading phase that you're talking about. And it made such a huge difference in their performance and their ability to grapple without that lactate thud is kind of what I call it, where you just feel like you're instead of operating at 80%, you're operating at like 20%. And you're not operating at 20%, but it makes you feel like that, which makes you feel like your performance is worse. But dude, I completely agree. Beta alanine has changed a lot of my athletes' lives, and using it correctly has changed a lot of performances.
Yeah, 100%. And I think probably the way that I think about it, or I explain it in terms of creatine as well, but beta alanine as well. On top of that is how much effort do you have to put in as an elite athlete to get a 2% improvement in your performance? It takes months and months and months, if not years, to slowly push that and drive that. And you need to be working it every day. But if you can just take a scoop of something and get that improvement, then that's huge, right? It makes a huge difference. And I've heard creatine is getting more expensive in the US. It's still very, very cheap in
It's not
Australia.
terrible.
Um,
Yeah, it's not terrible.
okay,
I mean,
that's
my
good.
monthly supply is $28 and I get some pretty high quality stuff. How do you feel about random? How do you feel about the gummies?
The creatine
Yeah,
gummies. Yeah, like, look, it probably wasn't when I first heard it. I was like, okay, whatever.
okay.
Like it is what it is. But the more that I have been around people that take it, the more I've realized that it's kind of just which way is going to convince you to get it in every day. And if that's the gummies, cool. If it's the powder, cool. Like the gummies will be a little bit more expensive, but if it means that you're actually going to be having it every day, much prefer
Yeah,
that.
I was thinking about switching up to that just to use myself as the test study and be like, hey,
Yeah,
let's see what works. But it
yeah,
just
was
seems
it's nice.
interesting, right? Because like the difference between I mean, of course, it interacts differently in your system. I would assume just by having to break it down, having to go through the jelly, which is in the gummy too, which adds a different wrinkle into this layer. But in all theories, supposedly the studies are good, so I'm gonna try it out myself.
Yeah, yeah, great, great.
um, Branching away from supplements, one of the other things I want to talk about is one of the hardest parts about combat athletics is being able to get your nutrients in between practice. But then also, one of the hardest things, myself as an athlete had a problem with this, is getting food in before practice, especially your morning workouts. What do you tell people that maybe they say they feel kind of like they kind of feel full or they feel like their stomach hurts when they start to have that nutrition before practice, even though we know from the performance side they need it, right? They need to get that stuff in before, especially before high intensity efforts, before wrestling practice, before jujitsu, before boxing, but they just refuse to because it makes them feel kind of eh.
Yeah, yeah. I think there's a few ways to go about it. We know absolutely that if you have carbohydrates before your training, especially early in the morning where you've spent an 8 hour period without eating and you're going to be in a slightly depleted state, it is going to make an improvement to your
Yeah,
performance. Definitely fully understand that there are plenty of people who are not used to that. And because of that, they struggle in terms of feeling heavy or feeling bloated. And if that's affecting their performance, that feeling, then it is something we look at. My solutions are thinking about your pre-training snack not as a it has to be exactly this, but as something that you can train. The same way that you wouldn't just on your day one in the gym squat. I'm going to try pounds 445.
that's
Is
a
that
fuck ton of weight.
what? Okay? Yeah. Okay. Same way you wouldn't just do that. You need to start low and you need to train your gut to get used to getting carbohydrates in. The more you can train your gut and the more your gut gets used to it, the more that it's going to be easier and easier to start having more. Right? We know that if you aren't having food around your training session, because there's no blood flow to your gut, it can actually start causing problems after a while because you're literally asphyxiating the gut. Like there's no oxygen going to the gut because it's going to everything else. But also from a performance standpoint, it's going to make a huge difference. The other thing that we look at is a lot of the times people, and this is after training as well. A lot of times people, because they want to be as professional as possible and because they want to be trying to do everything that they see online and do all the elite things, they will stray away from sugars or simple carbs. But it's really around training that you try and utilize that because you're going to be using that and because your body digests it faster. So if you can't have a banana 30 minutes before training, then it might just be having a few spoonfuls of honey, right? Or having some lollies or having a glass of juice. And it's about slowly building up from there.
Okay, nice. I like that. Um, I guess branching off that before we get into my next question, how do you feel about like fasted running and fasted cardio? I know a lot of athletes love it. It's one of those trendy things.
Mm.
What are your thoughts on
Yeah, I've gone so back and forth with this. So
it?
so many discussions and arguments about it. There are I don't think it's worth
I
it.
knew
Like
I
I
knew
don't
I
think
liked you.
yeah, I don't think it's an important thing. I know that people went through their whole careers doing it and they swear by
Yep.
it. But it's just a way to burn more calories and eat a little bit less. But um, if you can get fuel in, you're going to get more out of that, and you're probably going to burn more calories from that anyway.
Right.
So I always think fueling is best, and the more that you can fuel while still making weight, it's going to be the best thing you can do. Um, yeah, that would be my answer without attacking it too much.
Bro, you can attack it all you want. I shit on shit all the time. But no, I mean, you're 100% correct. Like when I think about from the coach side, what's the number one goal of what we're doing? The number one goal of what we're doing is to get as much out of the training session as possible. Well, then why am I not preparing myself to put myself in the best possible position to attack that training session? If I'm giving myself a disadvantage of not eating before, I'm not giving 100% in the effort. If I'm not giving 100% my effort, I left something on the table. And as I joke with my athletes all the time, like I'm more of a fighter than I am a doctor or a strength coach, right? Like I have that because I was a wrestler and that eats at me as an athlete that I wasn't giving 100%. When I look back on how shitty I ate, like it eats at me that I wasn't able to. I never gave 100% because of my nutrition habits. And why would you try to train like that and get your body doing that when you know that you can get at least a 10% gain off of just having some fucking carbs first? Like it doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't make sense in the paradigm of performance, but in general, it shouldn't make sense to anybody that wants to operate at 100%, which I feel like combat athletes of every sport want to.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's really just what is your goal for this session? Are you supporting your goal with nutrition? And if you're not because you're fasting beforehand, then that's a
Yeah.
problem.
Well said, my man. So we've talked a whole bunch, but I like to do a little TLDR for the people at the end.
Cool.
What are the three biggest tips that you can give an athlete to help get them more prepared for the nutrition side of combat sports?
Mm. Well, I would say number one, have
Okay.
carbs. Don't be scared of carbs. It's going to be huge for your performance. Number two is plan out your cut or plan out your sweat outs or your fight camp depending on the period of time between your weigh-in and the competition. Don't just follow what you see a UFC fighter doing because a lot of the time it's not good. But the other times it's just not appropriate for you. Even though they can do it, you're not going to be able to do it effectively because you're fighting 20 minutes after you weigh in. And number three, um, I would probably say just try and work with a professional. The more you can take stress away, yes, you want to be learning about why you're doing certain things and be able to sort of identify if that works for you. But the more stress you can take away, the more you're going to be able to focus on your performance and competing.
Yep. Just be an athlete. Do athlete things. You don't have to do
Yeah.
dietitian things. You don't have to do doctor things. You don't have to do strength coach things. Be an athlete. Do athlete things. A little bit out of order, but this is my last big question for you. So, a very big trend in MMA, combat sports, Jiu Jitsu, wrestling, boxing. I have athletes that are Muslim and they have to go through Ramadan.
Yeah.
How do you handle from the dietitian side an athlete that has to go through Ramadan, but they still are going to train? Because they are fasting and they aren't being able to operate at the highest optimal level. And we do know that if they're not having all of the calories they need and they're not having all the nutrition they need, that they're at a higher injury risk because they're not replenishing the storages that we need. From your side, how do you handle those types of athletes?
Yeah, it really depends on what the athlete's ability is to shift around their training schedule and shift around what they're able to eat. Probably the two things that I see the most, which causes problems, is one, their training is still during the day when the sun's up, um, and because some people like because they wake up when the sun has already come up and they're not eating in the morning, and then they fast throughout the day, and then they train and they haven't drunk anything. Massive drop in performance there. So if you can shift your training schedule to train at night or very early in the morning, depending on what your sleep schedule is, that's going to make a huge difference. And two is it's something that you really need to plan. I think a lot of people will take it as okay, once the sun has gone down and I'm eating, I'm just going to try and eat whatever. But a lot of the time, that means that you're almost definitely not getting enough protein. The distribution is obviously quite skewed, and you might not be eating the things that are actually benefiting your performance, and you might not be hydrating enough. So shifting your schedule if possible, and then also just making sure you have a plan when you do eat to make sure that you're hitting the right things.
Love it. Sweet. So we're going to get into, I have 3 questions I ask everybody when they hop on the podcast. First one,
Yep.
very simple. You get asked on every interview. What are some book or media recommendations for people to get better at the dietetic side of combat sports?
That's a good question because really combat sports dietetics is not something that's focused on too much, um, and there really aren't that many books.
Sounds like a
There's a
business opportunity, Alex.
yeah, I'll have to get into it, but, there's a Sigma nutrition book, that did one on, I wanna say it was boxing, but it might have just been combat sport in
Okay.
general. That one was good, and that one was really useful, and then, there's one that's come out from the Fight Dietitian as well, which was yeah, it was pretty good as well. So, those 2 I think are great. Um, Really, like most dietitians learned how to uh, get people to make weight by reading research papers, just because there aren't that many resources in terms of books.
Nice. Sweet. I like it. Are there any podcasts you've listened to or any sort of like documentaries, anything like that that you'd recommend?
Yeah, Building a Fighter is a pretty good
Love it.
one, I'd say.
Look at that plug. Shameless fucking plug, everybody.
That's the main one. Outside of that,
Oh,
in terms of
yeah.
dietetics,
Well, I
just
know, I think, doesn't Jordan have a podcast?
he does. He doesn't really talk about it, like, he doesn't really
Oh,
use
what the
it
fuck?
as much. His was great.
Yeah.
It was really useful. Podcast besides that, yeah, combat
Damn.
sports, weight
Okay.
cutting, not that
That sounds
much.
like a business opportunity, Alex. All right. So, question number 2. I'm going to ask you to not be humble for a second. Everybody has
Okay.
a superpower. Like one of my superpowers, I'm very good at bringing people together, and putting the puzzle pieces where they need to be. What is your superpower? What separates you from everybody else in your field?
Yeah, I think dietetics in general is a good space because the people that get into it are generally quite empathetic, and they're genuinely quite good at communication, and they understand the science. But I think a lot of the times there's a few people like in the weight cutting space where that empathy and that communication goes away, and they just focus on the science because it is a very in-depth area in terms of the science, and they decide to just focus on that, and they might just shoot a plan over and say, okay, like whatever, just like let me know if your weight's not tracking well. And I think in the combat sports space, and it would be the same with you, and one of the reasons that you set yourself apart is because there is a genuine care for the fighter, and there's a genuine care to make sure that they feel comfortable and that they know that they're doing everything properly. So it's probably that empathy and that communication, I think, that makes the biggest
I love
difference.
it. Sweet. And then last one. So, who do you think that I need to talk to and get on this podcast, to help further the combat sports space?
Mm, I think the best person to get on the podcast would be an Australian for
Love it.
sure.
Dude, I've had nothing but good experiences with Aussies.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good.
I'm like
Yeah,
batting 1,000 with working with Aussies. It's awesome.
good, good, good. I reckon the coolest person to get on a podcast like this would be an Australian fighter like Dana Coolwell or Tim
Okay.
Tszyu, who has gone and competed in America, because the experience they have fighting in America is very, very different to the experience they have fighting in Australia.
Okay.
And I think it'd be really cool to break that
That'd be
down.
sick. That would be fun. All right. So for the people at home, if they want to work with you, how can they work with you?
Yeah, probably the first thing is just look me up on Instagram, Alex Lamond Nutrition, or the website alexlamondnutrition.com. That would be the easiest way to find me. I do fight camps, one-off fight camps, but I also do a membership where really just every single thing around your nutrition is covered for you. You get full access to me during fight camps for the 6 weeks out. We get a weekly call on top of that full access where you can just message me or call me whenever. All your plans are set for you. And all of the things around your sweat outs and guidance around that is set for you as well, and customized depending on how you're going. And then I also give guides every month. I give resources every month, heaps of recipes, heaps of recipe books, and heaps of just extra information.
Sweet. I love it. And then, oh, you already had your Instagram. So that was my next question. How do they get in touch with you? Perfect. Well, dude, hey, I appreciate you hopping on the podcast. This has been awesome. I'm going to have to listen back to this one because there's some nuggets in there. But is there anything else you want to talk to the people?
No, I guess again, just thanks for having me on,
Bro,
mate.
it was fun.
It's
We should do this more often.
it's
This is a good
yeah,
vibe.
we should. Yeah, it's been good chatting.
Heck yeah. Well, dude, I appreciate you. And for everybody at home, this is Dr. Austin Shane, and thank you for listening.